Welcome to this tutorial. So in this tutorial I'm going to show you how you can combine materials with displacement. So usually you combine shaders with the mix shader node, but the mix shader node doesn't allow input for displacement maps, simply because displacement maps doesn't run through your shaders. So I'm going to show you a technique here where you can combine principled BSDF shaders with their own displacement. So what we're going to create is a little scene where we have a forest ground and a dirt road running through that forest ground. In this tutorial we're going to use Quicksort Bridge. It's basically a huge library with a bunch of 3D assets, materials, scans, surface imperfections, and it's all free to use. You just need to have an Epic Games account, which is also free, and then you have access to all of these assets. There's also a plugin that allows you to integrate with your project while you're working, so you can just directly push those assets to your project. You don't need to export and import. Alright, let's start by adding a plane to our scene. Scale it a bit so we have something to work with. Also subdivide a few times our plane so that we create a bit more polygons for our displacement. Now add as well a subdivision modifier. And actually what we want to use is adaptive subdivision. So go to your render settings, set it to cycles, and then set the feature set to experimental. And then you will see when you go to your subdivision modifier a checkbox for adaptive subdivision. So this adaptive subdivision will basically just subdivide things closer to the camera more than things that further away, which makes sense because you don't need as much details in the distance. Alright, let's look for some materials. Maybe a first material could be some forest ground, and if you found it, just download it and then you can export to your project. Note that it's important that in the export settings the displacement map is set to TIFF. JPEG is the default one, and JPEG is compressed and it will not work for your displacement. So just change that to TIFF and it will work perfectly fine. And do the same for a second material. So if you have installed the Blender plugin, once you have exported it will directly be in your project already. So you can just select it from there and start working on your materials. Now just make sure that in your material properties under settings and surface that you have selected displacement and bump. Now let's add perhaps maybe an HDRI to our scene so that you have a bit of some lighting in our scene that we can work with. So the only thing you need to do is play around with the scale of your displacement until you have a result that looks good. You can also just scale the texture by just scaling with the mapping nodes. Now let's do the same as well for the other material. Just scale the entire material with the mapping node and play around with the scale for the displacement. So I suggest to just clean up our setup and group the different textures and BSDF into one grouping node. Just clean up that we have only one input for that grouping node so that you can link that to our mapping and texture coordinate outside of that grouping node. Once that is done, just copy and paste everything and paste it into our other material, and you can just do it again for that material as well. Just group all the texture maps and the BSDF into one grouping node and remove all of these inputs so that you just have one input in that grouping node that you can link to our second mapping node. And now we are ready to start combining these materials. Now let's just add a mix shader node to combine both materials. And we can just link the different inputs and we use the factorial to control where to show which BSDF shader. So by default it's mixing both shaders, but we are going to make use of a black and white texture map to control that. So add an image texture and make sure that the base color is black. Now hold Shift and Ctrl and click on that image texture to see it in your viewport and move over to the Texture Paint tab. So just start painting over your plane. So everything that's white will display one BSDF and everything that's black will display another BSDF. Just make sure that you blend in both colors a bit so that everything is going smooth into each other. So basically just how nature works. Don't forget to save it, otherwise you will lose your work. And simply just add it then as an input for your factorial in the mix shader. So now you can control which BSDF is shown where exactly. Now it might be that both materials are not really compatible, but you can easily adjust that by adding a hue saturation node in between your texture and your base color input of the BSDF. Just play around with the values until you have one of those textures matching the color scheme of the other one. Now in terms of displacement, it only shows the displacement of one of the materials and it's not mixing both. So the way to solve that is simply by adding a mix RGB node to your setup and then going from the displacement outputs of your grouping nodes in the input of that mix RGB. So with that same painted texture map, you can actually control where to display which displacement as well. So you can still do a few things. So you can, for example, make sure that the path is a little bit more sunken, so just lower it a little bit, and then add as well perhaps a displacement modifier to your scene, because in general in the world everything is a little bit displaced. So just use a cloud texture, for example, to control the displacement of that plane. If you want to show your displacement just in one area, you can always make use of a vertex group as well. So just make a selection, then make a vertex group out of that selection, and then just apply that to your displacement modifier. And then you can just displace a certain area in your scene. Alright, thank you for watching. Hopefully you learned something today. So yeah, don't forget to subscribe and see you in the next one.